Certainly is good to see all of you. I've been telling people for years that I am actually a better preacher than the Apostle Paul was. In Acts 20, it took him until midnight to put someone to sleep, and I can do it in about 10 minutes. So, appreciate you so much being here tonight. Thank you. I'm sure Ashley has been in your prayers this evening. Thank you for that. She's feeling much better. Unfortunately, this little episode she had earlier today is not anything new, something she's dealt with most all of her life. Her mom had dealt with it, and I think Ashley started when she was about 9. Every now and then she'll just have a little episode. Her blood pressure gets really low, and she kind of blacks out a little bit and loses her ability to do anything. She's had a lot of different doctors to look at her in her home state of Georgia and here in Alabama as well, and no one's really been able to tell her exactly what it is. I think I even talked to Neil about it a little while one time a year or so ago, and no one's really been able to tell her what it is. So some have said it's like a seizure, some have said it's not, but it happens in a way that she can feel it coming on, and so she can know when it's time to get somewhere where she needs to be. I was actually teaching at one of the assisted livings I teach at on Thursdays, knowing that she was not feeling well when she went to work this morning, and that's when I got the call that she needed a ride home from work. So at the time, I normally leave at 3:15 to catch the bus with Vance and Double Springs, but I thought, well, I'll give myself a couple of extra hours and see how she's feeling, and I can probably make the last class. So I'm thankful to Vance and swapping with me, and I waited till about 5:30 before I left and wanted to be here with you. Sorry that I missed the other classes. I know they were great, and always enjoy being here and being a part of the classes. Tonight we are looking at assembling with the saints. Assembling with the saints is where we are. We're making our way through worship. You might want to go ahead and open your Bible to Joel chapter 1, minor prophet Hosea, then Joel, the last 12 in the English arrangement of the Bible that we have before us, last 12 of the Old Testament. As you know, I like to go ahead and include the verses in the outline, but I went ahead and added a couple of thoughts from the book of Joel and did not include those verses, so we might read a couple of verses from Joel chapter 1 and then Joel chapter 2 when we get there, and notice a little bit from that, but the rest will be in the outline if you want to follow along. Okay, assembling with the saints. Do we have to go to church today? How many times have you heard this question asked? How many times have you asked this question yourself? It is easy to think that this is an attitude that only children have, but in reality and observation, it is evident that many adults feel the same way, some of whom even call themselves Christians. And I wholeheartedly agree with what Roy said in parents where it's at. Sometimes, obviously, there have been those converted outside of the home, but so much emphasis placed on the home in Scriptures. The church, which is Christians, of course, assembles together to worship God. I've wondered if we change the phraseology to a different way of thinking, and actually a more biblical and accurate way of thinking, it would help our desire to attend. Perhaps instead of saying, it is time to go to church, or come on, we have to go to church, if we were to say something like, it's time that we come together with the church to worship God. Do our members know that there's a difference in the building and the people? Maybe that's a question to ask members when you go to church Sunday. Do you know the difference of what the people is? Which one is the church, the people or the building? Not all know. Would this help? I do not know if it'll help. But what will help is teaching our children and other adults the importance of church, worship, and the assembly. We cannot be saved outside of the church, Ephesians 5:23. And God expects us to assemble together, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. It's during this time that we're worshiping God. With joy, God's children should want and even desire the assembling of the saints. Now, I know you're here on a Thursday night, and that you do not have to make a decision Saturday night or Sunday morning if you're going to church. There's not a decision to be made. You go, unless you just cannot be there. But many, of course, wait until Saturday night or Sunday morning, as you know, to make that decision. We have joy in assembling together. That's why we look for additional opportunities, such as Thursday night gospel meetings and other opportunities. Too many people have the mindset of, I want to go to heaven and be with God for eternity, But I want to spend as little time with him as possible while on earth. When assembling with the saints to worship God, you're doing your part to help your church family, and they're doing their part to help you. So let's notice a little bit about assembling together. First of all, the Lord's Day. Throughout the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, you read about the Lord's Day or the Day of the Lord. As I mentioned in Joel, you see this a number of times in that short book in the Old Testament. Simply put, it's a day when the Lord intervenes. There have been many Lord's days or days of the Lord when he intervened in some special way, perhaps saving his people from doom or even allowing judgment from another nation upon them. For example, in Joel chapter 1 and verse 15, alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Now that was something coming soon, and a destruction at that point in time. But when you get to Joel chapter 2 and verse 31, you see, and actually as you know, this begins back in verse 28. In verse 31, the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Now there again, he's talking about the day of the Lord, but two different events. Joel chapter 1 was in that time, and judgment to be. But as you know, Joel chapter 2, beginning in verse 28, is what Peter begins his sermon with in Acts 2 on the Pentecost day, when he says, this is that, or this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. So Joel chapter 2 and verse 31, that day of the Lord is looking forward to that future time of prophecy about Pentecost and the beginning of the church. You read of day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 2, and that's clearly the judgment day. Today it's as if we trained ourselves to determine which day it is by the way we phrase it. For example, if I were to say the Lord's Day, remember John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, you would probably think of Sunday, the first day of the week. But if I were to say the day of the Lord, how it's phrased in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 2, you most likely think about the return of Jesus and the judgment day. However, how we phrase it makes no difference. The Lord intervenes when we worship, and he will certainly intervene when he returns to pronounce judgment. But when we're talking about the Lord's Day, on the first day of the week is what we're talking about. Obviously, we can assemble together 7 days a week if we want to. But certainly on that first day of the week, as Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10 calls the Lord's Day, the Lord's saints are to assemble together to worship him. The Apostle John said he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Think about John, this aged apostle, prisoner, and all that he had been through. He's a prisoner on the island of Patmos, and he worshiped on the first day of the week as best as he could, given the circumstances. And that's what's key here. He was doing what he could, given the circumstances, as a prisoner on that island. I have a good friend, Ken Gardner, who now lives in the Montgomery area, but most of his life he spent near Jackson, Mississippi. And after he was no longer able to travel overseas, he began doing jail ministry. So he focused his work to what he could do at home rather than traveling overseas. And he and I were talking about it. He converted a lot of people in the local jails where he was doing jail ministry and baptized a lot of people. And the sheriff would allow Bible studies, he would allow baptisms, but he would not allow the inmates to have the items needed for the Lord's Supper. And Ken and I were talking about it, and I said, well, Ken, I would tell the men to do what they can do currently. You know, I'd say go through all the areas of worship and spend a period of time on the Lord's Day reading the Scripture about the death and resurrection and pausing and thinking about it. You know, there's nothing they can do, not in their control, to actually eat the bread and drink the fruit of the vine. The sheriff will not allow it, but they can still, pause and think about that during that time, given the circumstances. You see John, given the circumstances, doing all he could. On the Lord's Day, he was in the Spirit. While we as Christians can and should worship on any day of the week, we must realize the utmost importance to assemble for worship on the first day of the week. Remember that Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. We're on page 2 now in your notes. And notice that these verses also remind us that the first day of the week is not the Sabbath day. You talk to your religious friends And many of them will call Sunday the Sabbath. They'll call it the Sabbath, and as if it's the Sabbath day. I remember, there's a few episodes of Andy Griffith where they're at church, and sometimes Barney will say, "Good Sabbath to you, Pastor," after they're leaving church. Well, there's two things that's doctrinally wrong about that statement, right? It's not the Sabbath day, and that's the denominational pastoral system. But a lot of people think that Sunday is the Sabbath day, and it's not, of course. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 1, notice it now. Now, after the Sabbath, after the last day of the week, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week, as you know. Mark chapter 16 and verse 1, now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices, that they might come and anoint him. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. The last verse of Luke 23, verse 56, then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Chapter 24, verse 1, now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning. There's a difference, of course, from the Sabbath day to the first day of the week. John chapter 20 and verse 1, now the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark. So we remember and we realize that Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. Also, the church began on the first day of the week. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 1, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. But when you reference that back to Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 and 16, you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Well, there's 7 days in a week. 7 days in a week times 7 weeks is 49, right? 7 times 7 is 49. 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. So the events in Acts 2, that Pentecost day, were on the first day of the week. The New Testament church met especially on the first day of the week for worship. Now, I included that word especially because you see them meeting throughout together daily. But there was that special emphasis on the first day of the week. Quite often we looked at Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, now on the first day of the week, but don't forget the previous verse. They got there to Troas where we abode or where we stayed 7 days. It was so important for them and to them to be with the Lord's saints on the first day of the week for that first day worship, that they waited 7 days until the next first day to be together. I'm going to circle back around to that a little later in our notes. On that first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 1, Paul writing to the church at Corinth. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, notice this, let each one of you, we all have our own individual responsibility in worship, as I have been trying to emphasize, and I'll continue to do so. You can come together to a meeting house of the Lord's church where worship is being conducted correctly, according to the New Testament plan, but yet I can individually not worship or not worship correctly that day if I'm not giving my best to God. Each one of you lays something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there may be no collections when I come. We all have a responsibility to worship God. You remember in John chapter 4, we're talking about why the first day of the week. It's the Lord's day. It's the day he was resurrected. It's the day the church began. The New Testament church met on this day. Jesus said in John chapter 4 and verse 24 that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Well, that includes all of what God has directed in his word. As you know, a familiar verse that we go to quite often when talking about assembling together, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 through 26. Again, a lot of times people will want to quote 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. Well, if you've been around very long, someone has asked you, maybe even tried to argue with you, yeah, but does that really mean every Sunday, and does that really mean every time the church comes together? My response to that is you can take Hebrews 10:25 out of your Bible if you want to. If it's that important to you to try to argue away Hebrews 10:25, then cut it out of your Bible. You're already called it, verse 24. Notice this. Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. If I choose not to assemble with you, now sometimes I don't have the choice. I realize that. Sometimes you don't have the choice. Oftentimes health, of course, comes up, and you do not have a choice. I'm talking about when there's a choice in the matter. Sometimes we do not have the choice. But when there's a choice in the matter, who do I love more than God and God's people that they're getting my attention when the rest of my church family's worshiping? That's where I would go. I'd go to verse 24. Because I'm saying to you as my church family that something else is more important to you, something else is more important to God at this time when it is a selected time for the local congregation to assemble together. Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. It is the Lord's day. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10. Not your day nor mine. It belongs to the Lord. Therefore we do not use it for our own purpose, but rather we worship the Lord in His own appointed way. And that's something we must continue to emphasize over and over and over. It's God's way. We're not the one receiving worship. We're not the one calling the shots when it comes to worship. It's God's way. He has chosen worship, and we must worship as He teaches us to do so. Notice next, preparation for the Lord's day. Much of what we do Monday through Saturday determines what worship will be like on Sunday. As with all areas of life, preparation is needed for worship. And perhaps worship needs even more focus and dedication than anything else you do in life. We talked a little bit about that last week in a sermon by Batsell Barrett Baxter. Do you want purposeful worship? It begins with preparation, and it follows into participation. So remember, it's all in that preparation, all in getting ready, and then it's carrying it out in worship. Consider, for example, the following three. Consider your relationship with God. I saw a church sign that said, God wants more than weekend visits. But how often is it the case that that's all God is getting? The weekend visits, just showing up at the church building. Can one really worship in spirit and truth, having spent little to no time with God during the week? Think about that. Do you even know who God is? Do our members, do they even know who God is when they show up on Sunday morning? Have they heard from God through studying the Bible since the final amen the week before? Or has God heard from them in prayer since the final prayer the week before? Now, I put a personal note here that's not in your notes. I do think there's that which the leadership within a congregation can do to help and encourage and promote, both in the shepherds as well as the preachers, can be an assistance sometimes if you want to, and maybe announcing your sermon topics beforehand and saying, hey, sometimes there's changes, I realize that, but say this is what we're going to study. One of my responsibilities is to also write an article each week in the bulletin, and I'll be honest with you, writing is not my strong suit, and nor do I like it at all. I wish I did not have to do that. I really do. And I always struggled with getting the articles in. I have recently, I guess in this last year or so, I started by taking the sermon. Our articles are due Monday morning. It's a weird system. They're due Monday morning so they can be mailed out by the end of the week and so forth. But I started taking the sermon I preached on Sunday, then giving some additional thoughts to the sermon so people could use that as a way to continue studying the sermon. And really, again, I was trying to find an easy way to write my articles, just to be honest. And it turned out kind of good. But then I swapped it and I started kind of putting a preview to my upcoming sermon, because they're getting the bulletin a few days before. So I started kind of putting a preview and sometimes even the sermon outline. And I've heard a lot of responses of people who have appreciated that and their preparation for worship. So it's encouraging them at home to study and also study what the upcoming sermon is. I'm not saying you have to do that, But that's been something that's been helpful for me and some of our members in using that in their preparation for worship on Sunday. Also, you must consider your relationship with others. We assemble to teach and encourage one another in love. If I'm not in the assembly, I'm not doing my part to help the church. As you know, there's no room for division. This is covered a number of times throughout Scriptures. Jesus even talked about it in the Sermon on the Mount of leaving and making things right with your brother, then going back. Division is not coming together for the better, but for the worse. Before Paul gets into correcting how they are to partake of the Lord's Supper, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 17, "Now giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse." We don't want to do that. We don't want to come together in our congregations for the worse. We want to come together for the better. And we want to do what is right. So we must consider our relationships with one another. And if there's something that we have against one another, especially with those that you worship with in your home congregation, we want to try to resolve that in a godly way so our worship will not be hindered. But also consider the family relationship. Is before worship the time to bring up a conversation that might lead to an argument or hurt feelings? Quite often, that's when people choose to have such conversations. This goes for the spouses and for parents and children. Do all you can to help your family focus on worship, and especially do your part to refrain from causing them to lose focus. You know, that Sunday morning, especially Saturday night, Sunday morning, I want to do all I can to keep the focus on God and godly things. I don't want to bring up anything that might cause hurt feelings or even an argument as we're trying to mentally prepare ourselves to go to worship. Some of that can wait until later. But notice also your relationship with time. What kind of day do you have on the job if you oversleep or run late for any other reason? What kind of morning do you have when the night before was late and activity filled? How do you use your Sunday morning and afternoon? Now, all of that plays in to our worship. Now, I don't know how you choose to do it or how you chose to do it, but for us, I'm not trying to pat our back. Saturday night is the same as a school night because Sunday morning is worship, and that's even more important than Monday through Friday school. So that's how we've chosen to. I'm not saying that we don't sometimes stay out a little later, but Friday night is, for the most part, our fun night. That's our free night. And Saturday night is a preparation for worship. In most cases, our congregations have selected a time for Bible study and worship that is usually later than our Monday through Friday week, right? Say you begin at 8 o'clock Monday through Friday for work or school. Most congregations, not all, some start earlier in the morning, but most are 9 or 10 before they begin. You know, we actually have extra time on Sunday that we can use and use wisely if we're willing to do so, but quite often, again, we're using it for personal use, and we're not really focused upon the worship. So many Christians and congregations put forth special effort during the week in the planning phase of worship. But do you? Here's where we're each needing to pull our own part. You might want to jot down 1 Corinthians chapter 12 here. The body, where we're all doing our own part and working together. For example, on Sunday when you're taking the Lord's Supper, have you ever stopped to think, who ordered this? Who made sure that we have this in our building so we can take it? Have you ever stopped to think, who was the first person here to unlock all the doors and turn on all the lights? Have you ever stopped to think, I wonder who the last person is to make sure that these doors are locked? You know? I wonder how much time the song leader put into selecting songs and practicing them. Or the preacher into preaching that sermon, how much study went into it. The point is there's so much work being each week by members to help prepare the congregation for worship. Stop and think, am I doing my part to help the congregation where I worship, even in the preparation during the week? Or am I content with saying, I'll show up, you'll take care of me, and I'll leave? And that's okay. You can do that for me if you want to. We need to make sure that we're all doing our part. That's all in the preparation. Notice next the coming together. We read about people in the Old Testament worshiping alone, such as Noah and Abraham and Job. However, in the New Testament, with the exception of John the prisoner, you see that the emphasis is continually on the church coming together and worshiping together. And again, even to the point of planning the schedule to worship with the saints. Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 7, they waited. They stayed there for a week so they could be there on the first day of the week. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 20, therefore, when you come together in one place. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 23, therefore the whole church comes together in one place. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 41, then those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, the coming together. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 26, when he had found him, this is Barnabas finding Saul. When he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church. You see the coming together. And again, I realize there are times when it's not possible. I understand that. Make sure you understand that I'm emphasizing when you have a choice in the matter. When you have a choice in the matter and choosing not to come together. And again, I know that this group is going to be at worship and going to be there for every time. I realize that. But hopefully maybe there's something that we can do to encourage our members. If okay for some to not assemble, then why not all? Which of these some, quote some, has a biblical authority to not be there and when? Why is it okay for some to not go but not all? Peter opened his mouth and said, in a truth I perceive that God shows no partiality. Acts chapter 10 and verse 34. Well, if God expects me to be at worship, doesn't he expect all people to be at worship and all of his children? Two silent threats to the local congregation in worship. As I already mentioned, Jesus died to establish the church, and we must be in it to go to heaven. While there are many attacks on the church from outside, it's the ones from within that alarms me the most. Sometimes these threats are in complete innocence. Now, I've left these blank because there might be somewhat of an opinion that you can agree or disagree with, but I also want to make sure I explain where I'm coming from with these two areas I want to present to you. Remember, again, Jesus died for the church, to give us the church, to give us the local congregation. And the reason I call these silent threats is because this is what I'm observing as a member of the Lord's church from not outside attacks, but well-meaning Christians. I'm not saying that they should stop, but I'm saying we need to always not be asleep, right? Matthew 13, while men slept. We need to not be asleep on these things. One is, sometimes the local congregation is attacked by what we call works of the church. And we have to be careful. We need to make sure our members remember, and we remember, the emphasis on the church. Sometimes people will comment on a work of the church and say, this is the greatest thing the church has going for it. The greatest thing the church has going for it is the church, is the local congregation. There are a lot of good works run by Christians, and nothing wrong with them at all, until they start competing with the church. Have you ever heard someone say, we're baptizing more than any church in the area? Close your doors. Because the Lord did not die for these works that you're talking about. He died for the church. And we're not competing with the church. These are works to promote and teach the Bible. But some of these, if we're not careful, we'll think that they're greater than the local congregation. And we'll place more emphasis on that than the local congregation. So much so, it's been my observation that sometimes these works will get identities. And I can tell you, we've experienced losing members because the identity did not match up to certain works within the church. I hope I can explain that in a loving way and you're understanding what I'm saying. We just have to be careful with this. Another, what I call silent threat, online worship. How many times have you heard that spoken of in the last 4 years since COVID hit? I've heard people say, and now again, by choice. By choice. It's a great thing if someone's sick or shut in and cannot be there to be able to take part in that way. But I, as a preacher, I've heard so many people by choice say, well, we're just going to do it online. and not put forth any effort to assemble with the Lord's saints. Even though in Acts chapter 20, they waited a week. I think worship is so important that even in our travels, whether work or fun or whatever, the first thing we should do is plan where we're going to be for worship. And then we plan the rest of it around that. But I've heard people say, well, hey, we were traveling, so we pulled you up driving down the road. I don't, can that really be worship? I mean, is that intent there to give it your best? Furthermore, here's my question. I've heard so many people talk about online worship, but you know what I've not heard? I've not heard one person provide one verse for the authority of it. Can you produce one verse for the authority? Now, I'm not saying stop it, because it is good for those who can't be there. But many have come to choose that. Many have come to choose, even if it's more convenient. And if we cannot provide a verse for its authority, is that not denominationalism? Is that not the definition of denominationalism? Doing what I want to do without a biblical authority for it. And I think these are pretty much threats and attacks on the local congregation. The sobering conclusion: could you imagine the Lord returning during the appointed time to assemble for worship and you being anywhere else? I've often wondered, what if the Lord returns during Sunday evening worship? I wonder that often. What if the Lord returns when the elders said, look, here's a good time for us to meet and worship, and by choice I said something else is more important. But think about this. Which worship will be your last? I never really thought about that until preparing this lesson. For the faithful children of God, we'll go to worship on the Lord's Day, and before the next Lord's Day, we'll meet our death. We just don't know. Which worship will be your last? Have you ever thought about that? At which given time will this be my last? Well, shouldn't we want to make the most out of every worship? In Luke chapter 22 and verse 15, Jesus said, this is the night of the betrayal. He said, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Notice, fervent desire. This was the Lord's last Passover meal to eat, and he had a desire to eat it with his apostles. Do we have the same desire to assemble with our church family and worship God? Now, I know you do, and I feel guilty kind of for presenting this lesson, but I'm hoping maybe in some way perhaps we can take it to our home congregations and help those who might not have such the same desire. So we thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of the classes tonight. Once again, thanks to Vance and Roy and Levi and adjusting the schedule tonight and allowing me to come in a little later. We look forward to being with you again next week in October. It'll be October when we assemble together again. I think Tuesday is October the 1st. But we hope that you have a great week and a safe ride home tonight. We'll ask Brother Perryman if he was. Is there anything else before we close? Brother Perryman, would you mind leading us in a dismissal prayer?